Good morning and good afternoon. This is Dan Bauman over at LoadTrek.net. Welcome to the latest in the LoadTrek 101 webinars. Today is lesson 10, focusing on driver rotation. So we see the LoadTrek for this year so far, and today is February 22nd. We're currently looking at lesson 10, driver rotations. And so today's webinar will focus primarily on how to set up a driver rotation. Well, I guess first off, what is a driver rotation, how to set one up, and in a simple fashion, we'll create a simple rotation involving a couple static loads, and we'll go from there. There are some advanced functionality associated with the rotations. We can hold a follow-up webinar on any questions that get into that realm as far as some of the things that we'll discuss a little bit later here. So feel free to pose those questions, and based on the number of questions and what we get, the feedback that we receive, then we'll possibly schedule another kind of advanced driver rotation webinar, which is what we would do outside of the normal LT 101 schedule. We would set one up perhaps as early as next week if we have a lot of questions on some more advanced functionality of the rotations. But before we can get there, we have to discuss obviously the basic principle of the driver rotation and what it does and what it means. So that's what we'll do here today. I think most folks have been on these webinars before, but if you don't, you should see a little question area in the control panel there where you can type in any questions you have. I'll be happy to answer those questions aloud, read them aloud, and answer them in case anyone else has a similar question. So here's our LoadTrek 101 schedule. Today's lesson 10, lesson 11 early next week, lesson 12 on Wednesday, and then the final two lessons, 13 and 14, in the first week of March. So it gives you an idea of what we're expecting coming up. Next up is fuel tickets and IFTA report, and then reports and data views, the various different reports and data views you can use in the system. Then we're going to get into the analysis plane, and then finally the maintenance plane. So we'll close our schedule for now. Everyone should see my screen. If you haven't already, it's the LoadTrek startup screen in the background. My mouse is moving in small circles in the center, and that's what we see there. And so now let's take a look. As I minimize my control panel here, we'll take a look inside the driver rotation section. Now if we look at our startup screen, there's a couple ways we can get into our driver rotations. As we scan through the list of planes that we have available or areas in the software, the static load plane is what we covered on Monday, how to create static loads and edit static loads. The rotation plane would be what we refer to as the driver rotations. And we use the term rotation in the sense that the driver assignments rotate on some basis, usually a weekly basis or a multiple of a weekly basis. And what we mean by that is if we have a series of loads that we want to auto-assign to the drivers on a weekly basis. For example, driver John takes a trip for this freight customer every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And so that would be a 7-day rotation. Every 7 days, we reassign that same Monday load to John, and the same Wednesday load, and the same Friday load. So that would rotate on a weekly basis, a 7-day rotation. Something that would be a bi-weekly basis would be a scenario where perhaps driver Bill takes a load for a different customer, and he takes it every Tuesday, Thursday, and every other Saturday. So Bill takes it Tuesday, Thursday, every other Saturday. On the alternating Saturdays, maybe Rich takes it. And so because that alternates every other weekend, we would set that up as a 14-day rotation. That'll be a little more clear as we create the rotation. And so we can get there by clicking on the words rotation plane here, the icon with the clock and the Route 66, and it matches the icon up here that we refer to as static projects. Another term that we use for rotations. Most things in LoadTrek unfortunately have two terms with just the nature of the different markets that we cover. Rotations, the most common term you'll see in this case, although the toolbar icon here will say S projects or static projects. When we first open our rotation window, it's going to be probably one of the few areas in LoadTrek that isn't comprised of the 3 windows. Basically, we have no load tree in this view. Prior to any other lesson here, or inclusive of any lesson we've had so far, there's always been 3 windows. There's the button window here, which is normally in the center of the screen, and on the right there's some details that you can edit. But on the left, there was always, over here on the far left, there was always that load tree or jobs tree that showed us all our existing loads and jobs. When we first opened up the rotation plane or the rotation area here, we don't have that. Basically, this is going to be a little bit different from a visual layout. Not much, but we don't have that far left window. We do still have the buttons on the left-hand side. We see that they're named kind of funky here. The first one's called Setup, and then Sequence, and then Driver Schema, which is short for Driver Schematic, and Equipment Schema, which is short for Equipment Schematic. And then we have a Drivers ... and an Equipment button. And we're going to cover all those as we get forward. Once again, we always have our Show Legend Doc Forms and Closed Plane down at the bottom. So let's take a look at what's on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, we have a window called Rotation Schedule, and that shows us a list of all our current driver rotations. And we're going to talk now about what a driver rotation is. A driver rotation is used in LoadTrek for the purpose of auto-assigning or auto-dispatching static loads that we've created to the appropriate driver on the days that he or she runs them. And so that being said, it would take a static load from the static load list that posts into our daily dispatch on a daily basis or ahead of time, a few days in advance, however our posting setting is set. Basically, these static loads show up, and let's use tomorrow as an example. On the 23rd of February, there'll be some static loads that we've created in our system that will be available on the 23rd and be ready to be dispatched to a driver. Now, normally, as we've discussed in some previous lessons in the route plane, the dispatching is done by dragging the stage over and assigning it to the driver in the route plane. We're going to automate that process through these driver rotations. It basically gives us the ability to assign a certain stage of a load to a particular driver on the days of the week that they run it. And so it's a way to auto-dispatch loads and trips in our system so that we don't have to manually dispatch them when they post. And that's the concept behind a rotation and why we allow you to create them in the system, to save you some time dispatching loads that every Monday go to John and every Tuesday go to Rich and every Wednesday go to Bill. We can simply build that into a rotation if there's no changes and have the system auto-dispatch or auto-assign those stages of those loads. Once that happens, once the rotation does that auto-assignment for us, we can then, in the route plane, add other trips and loads and other tasks onto that driver, but it'll at least take away all the stuff that's consistent on a regular basis and automate that based on the driver rotation. So that being said, we see we have a list or a list view in the center of this window here, and this lists all of the rotations that have already been created in our test database. We're going to create one, and then we're going to add to an existing one as part of our training here today. And so that's what we see here. Over on the right is just the details of whichever one of these rotations that we click on. So if I click on this Milwaukee rotation here, it's going to be one that we're going to manipulate later. We can see some details of the rotation. The rotation name is called Milwaukee. The rotation start date was way back in 2005. The rotation day cycle, this rotation rotates every, or renews every 7 days. So what we expect to see is that these drivers are assigned in a 7-day rotation, in the sense that on Monday, if Jim takes the load, then the following Monday he'll take the same load, the Monday after that, and so on and so forth. So it repeats a 7-day cycle. This number in most circumstances, 99, 98% of the time is going to be a multiple of 7 because the calendar works on a 7-day rotation. Then every Monday would be every 7 days, and then 14 and so on. And so the most common day cycle that we see is a 7-day rotation. The second most common is a 14-day rotation that can deal with alternating weekends for loads that runs on weekends, and different drivers take it alternatingly. And then we could have rotations up until 28 days if it's a monthly rotation. Drivers alternate quite a bit within the month, but we can program that so that it rotates every 28 days. And then theoretically you could have a 365-day rotation where a different driver takes it every day excuse me, of the year, and so that would just be too big to manage. So we always encourage you to kind of keep it in a 7 or 14-day mode. You can go higher than that if you need to, and there's usually only a few examples where that comes into play. Underneath the day cycle, we see the rotation origin and the rotation destination. If you recall, in the route plane, let's take a look. Actually, let's go back to the route plane if we can for this test that we're looking at. We're going to look at some loads from last week. I'm going to manually assign a few stages to drivers and talk about which portions of the process can be automated through the rotation. And so let's go and let's change our options here. Let's go back to maybe a week or two ago. So let's grab the 15th day that we weren't here, and then over on the left we'll grab some loads. We may have some loads in there for the 15th. Hopefully we do. And we'll look at all of our customers by clearing the criteria. Did I hit cancel? We may not have too many loads in there. Let's go back even further then. Okay, and so let's take, these loads may not be populated, back on the 3rd. Let's go back a little bit further yet into January, and we'll find maybe a load that's uncovered that we didn't assign. Perfect example here. So let's just go back in time for test purposes. We'll take a look back on January 16th. This load that was scheduled to run was never assigned, so we'll go through and manually assign that. So here's a load here on the left-hand side for Hallman Paints. It's a load for a freight company that we need to deal with, and it's a single-stage load. It goes from Hallman Sun Prairie to Hallman Delafield in the afternoon on the 16th. And so when we manually assign a trip or a load in LoadTrek to a driver, it creates a route on the driver. So let's manually do that. We do that by left-clicking on the stage, yellow stage number 1, and we drag it over, and we drop it on. Let's drop it on Mr. Bus here. And it's going to tell us this driver does not meet the qualifications of the load. That's something we discussed in previous lessons, but we'll say, yeah, Mr. Bus is qualified to run that. And so what happens during the manual process is a few things. We grab the little yellow stage number 1, we drag it over, we drop it on Mr. Bus. What that does is it then creates a route that we assign to Mr. Bus. And that route consists of an origin, that's the first stop you see here called LoadTrek Office, the 2 scheduled stops of the load, that matches the 2 stops you see here, and then adds in a destination. And when we create a route in LoadTrek, we always add in an origin and a destination. The reason for that is we always want to track what happens from the moment the driver gets in the vehicle till they get to their destination and get out of the vehicle. So although this customer is paying us to go from Sun Prairie to Delafield, we're going to create a route on the driver that starts at wherever they get in the truck, the yard or the office, and then their travel to the first stop, the delivery at the second stop, and their travel back to their home location or the home office. And so that's why whenever a route is created, there's always 2 extra stops added to the load that's assigned, the origin and destination. So that process of manually grabbing the stage and dropping it on Mr. Bus, this is what we're going to automate through a driver rotation. If Mr. Bus takes this every, the 16th was, I don't recall what day of the week that was, but if Mr. Bus takes this load every day, he takes this Sun Prairie to Delafield load, then we can build a rotation in the system that will automate that process that I just did, dragging it over and assigning it to Mr. Bus. If we were to automate that process, then we need to know where his origin and where his destination will be on those days that he takes this load. And it's for that reason that in the rotation section, if we go back into that area, you'll see that we have a spot in there when you create the rotation to put in the driver's origin and destination, because we'll need to know that. Right now, when we manually assign that, it's driven off of my username. It knows that any loads that the admin person assigns in LTGPS, the name of this database, is going to put in LoadTrek Office as the origin and destination. So here in that Milwaukee rotation we were looking at earlier, we see we put in the origin and destination of the Milwaukee yard. What that means is that any drivers that are going to be assigned loads as part of this driver rotation we've created will have on their route on those days the origin and destination of the Milwaukee yard. So that's why we have spots in the rotation to put that information in. So whenever this rotation runs and it assigns Monday's load to Jim and Tuesday's loads to Bill and Wednesday's loads to Rich, all of those guys are going to begin and end in the Milwaukee yard, so that's the origin and destination for this rotation. If we were to build a rotation where the drivers are leaving out of Madison, we may have the LoadTrek office as the origin and destination, and that'll be different than areas where the drivers leave out of Milwaukee. So more often than not, we always want to keep in mind that the origin and the destination of this driver rotation are going to be based on where these drivers start and end their day. So my drivers that leave out of Milwaukee will probably have an origin and destination in the Milwaukee area. My drivers that leave out of Lincoln or someplace like that may leave out of some Nebraska type origin and destination. So a lot of these rotations that you see in the system, and we borrowed these from one of our customers, are going to be based out of where those drivers, their home office or their home terminal. And so that's why you see a lot of the rotations are named based on the city from which the drivers leave and start from. In this case, this one here called Milwaukee. And finally, there's a little box here that says active. Whenever you create a rotation, if you want it to be active right away, meaning that as soon as the rotation is created and we've assigned the trips to it or the static loads to it, then beginning in the evenings when those static loads post into the database, these assignments will also occur if this rotation is active. So you can create the rotation, leave it inactive by unselecting this box, or make it active right away if you wanted to begin assigning the drivers that very evening for any dates that haven't yet posted in your database. There's also a box here that says end date. It's always, the default is to have it not selected, but if you knew that this driver assignment is going to run to a certain date, you can select end date and then set a date. At that point, although the static loads may continue to post in your database, the auto assignment of the drivers will stop. And so if you wanted that to stop at a certain time, you can select end date. More often than not, this is unselected. And if the rotation needs to change, you can modify it. If it stops altogether, you can simply unselect the active box. And so that's an example of the setup section. Right now we're in the setup section of the rotations, and this is what we see. The buttons on the left, the list of rotations in the center, and the details of that rotation on the right-hand side, the setup of it anyway. We're going to work down our list here in order as we create a rotation. And we're going to do that now. We're going to create a new one called Madison. And first thing I like to do before I create a rotation is I want to look at the static loads that are going to be a part of this rotation. And so sometimes our first step is actually going into our static loads or static jobs, the area we were in yesterday when we talked about all the loads that are in our database that run on a continual basis. We've built them. We've scheduled them to run every Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or whatever days of the week they run, and then they post into our database on those individual days. It's these static loads that become part of the driver rotation. So we have a whole slew of static loads here on the left-hand side. What I'm going to do is filter this a little bit because our test database is pretty large, and let's just look at that customer 123DB, which is our example customer that we've worked with quite a bit. So now I just want to see all the static loads that pertain to this customer 123DB. The customer I'm using in this example is similar to what we would see in the mail contracting world, but this could be a freight customer as well. We saw it earlier with Hallman Paints and some other freight customers. If they run every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or every day of the week like some of these loads do, then you can include them in a driver rotation as well. Even if they only run one day a week, you can still build that into a rotation, provided it repeats every 7 or weekly every 7 days. The two loads that we want to assign or auto-assign to a driver rotation are these two loads here, and we'll take a look at them. This first load, I should open that again, goes from the Milwaukee post office to a relay, and then from the relay to the Madison post office. A very simple run in the grand scheme of things. We see it's a two-stage load, meaning that one driver takes it from the Milwaukee post office to the Lake Mills relay, and then another driver takes it from the Lake Mills relay to the Madison post office. Now the second trip is kind of the reverse of the first. A driver leaves out of the Madison post office, goes to the Lake Mills relay. A second driver, we see there's two stages here, goes from the Lake Mills relay back to the Milwaukee post office. So what really happens here is that the driver that leaves out of Milwaukee, driver A, and goes to the Lake Mills relay on this trip, or this load, then hooks up with the driver out of Madison, driver B, and he takes the second stage from the Lake Mills relay back to Milwaukee. So driver A's route will be stage 1 of this load coupled with stage 2 of this load, and that brings him back to Milwaukee and he goes home for the night. The other driver is exactly the opposite of him. He takes stage 1 of this load from Madison to the relay and then finishes with stage 2 of this load from the relay back to Madison. So that takes him home, and he lives in the Madison area. So these two guys meet every day that it runs and at the Lake Mills relay, and they swap trailers and they go on, or they slip seat and finish up and return the next day. And so this is kind of a simple scenario where drivers leave out of different locations at approximately the same time. You see this driver leaves Milwaukee at 15:15. This driver leaves Madison at 15:45. They meet at the relay, and we've built these static loads so that the relay times line up for the drivers. He gets there at 16:50, and he gets there at 16:50, and leaves out of there 5 minutes later and is on their way. And so it's kind of an example of how you build a static load with two stages and another one with two stages, and the drivers take stage 1 of one load and stage 2 of another, and likewise for the guy out of Madison. So if we build our static loads like this, then we can build them into a driver rotation very simply. I like to look at the static loads first because that helps me understand how they're going to operate. Driver A is going to go from Milwaukee to Lake Mills relay, and then from the relay back to Milwaukee, and vice versa. Driver B is going to leave out of Madison and then meet up and go home. It's important that I look at this, and I also look at the frequency for these. This one here, this trip, if I close it and open it, refreshes my frequency, and I see it runs every Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So we don't run this on Monday, Saturday, or Sunday. So it's only Tuesday through Friday that this load runs. Likewise, since it meets with this load, I'm expecting this load to have the same frequency. And sure enough, it does. It runs every Tuesday through Friday. And so because the weekend's not in play, I can build this as a 7-day rotation. So the driver that takes it on Tuesday out of Milwaukee and meets the other driver out of Madison on Tuesday, it may be the same two drivers in my rotation. And so I can build it that way. It's important to know the frequency of the static load that you're going to include in the rotation and how it's laid out, basically the route of travel that the drivers will do. So we review that in the static loads, and then we can go into our static projects and create these 2 rotations if we need 2 rotations. Now, why would we possibly need 2 rotations? The answer to that is the drivers are leaving out of and returning to 2 different locations. The driver out of Milwaukee is leaving out of Milwaukee, coming back to Milwaukee. The driver out of Madison is leaving out of Madison and coming back to Madison. So we may need 2 rotations to cover these auto assignments, and that'll become clear in a second. I look on my rotation list. I don't have a Madison rotation for drivers that leave out of the Madison area. If I scan through here, I don't see anything called Madison that would trigger me to believe that it runs out of Madison. So I'm going to create that one. And the way we do that is we click Add, and you'll see that'll clear our details on the right-hand side. And we type in the name of this rotation, and let's just call it Madison for ease of titling here. Some folks like to put in the customer, so maybe they could put in 123 DB Madison to let you know. There may be other rotations for different customers out of Madison. Rotation start date is our next choice. When do we want to start this? Well, we want to start it this week, but let's start it at the beginning of the week, the 19th. That'll be explained here in a moment. You always want to have your rotation start primarily on either a Sunday through Saturday or a Monday through Sunday or some weekly day that you always want to be the beginning of your rotation. The reason that is that most rotations are on weekly basis, every 7 days, every 14 days. So as you're looking at your rotations, and once you build a bunch like we have here and you toggle between them, you always want the first day to always be the same day of the week. It doesn't have to start on the same date. They don't all have to start on February 19th, but I encourage you to always start them on the same day of the week. So we're going to start this one on a Sunday because it's the beginning of the week for our purposes. Looks like there's a question here, but let's see that. All right. There's a question there related to the Saturday to Sunday wraparound, I believe, in the rotations, and we're going to answer that one a little bit later, if that's okay. Take a look at that. So the next field here, this rotation start date, we're going to have that start on a Sunday, and then we're going to get into the rotation day cycle. When does this rotation repeat itself? As we mentioned earlier, as we looked at those static loads, they run every Tuesday through Friday. They don't run on Monday, Saturday, and Sunday. But in my knowledge of how they're assigned to drivers, I know that the guy that takes it on Tuesday of this week, he's going to be the same guy that takes it Tuesday the next week and Tuesday the following week, etc. Same thing on Wednesday and Thursday, etc. It's the same person that takes it on those days. If that's the case, then this rotation is a weekly rotation. It repeats itself every 7 days. If you have a scenario where on the first Tuesday of every month it's driver Jim, and the second Tuesday of every month it's driver Bill, and then the third is driver Jim, and then the final Tuesday of every month is driver Bill, then that would be a 14-day cycle in the sense that every other Tuesday is how it repeats itself. Bill on the first Tuesday, Jim on the second, and then Bill on the third and Jim on the fourth. So it would just repeat itself every 14 days, and then we'd set that up as a 14-day cycle. Our next step is to put in the origin. Now this is a Madison rotation. In this case, the origin is where do the guys that are going to be part of this rotation leave from and return to at the end of the day. The answer to that, in this case, we're just going to put in the LoadTrek office as the origin and destination, because that's where the guys get in the truck to start their day, and that's where they get out and finish their day. And I'm going to make it active right away. So once I have my fields here, I'm not going to put in an end date because this is going to run on and on. If any drivers change, I can edit it. I don't have to necessarily turn it on and off all the time, so we'll just leave it open-ended with no end date. If I left-click on the list on the left, it'll add that new rotation to my list here. Later on, when I come back to it, it'll sort alphabetically, but for now it'll add it down at the bottom, this Madison rotation. So that's the setup section. Now we're going to go down to our sequence section and talk about what we can do there. We then click on sequence, we highlight the rotation we're interested in, click on sequence. Now we get back to our familiar 3-window setup. We're over on the left, we have our jobs or our load tree. In the center we have our buttons, and on the right we have an empty space here called the rotation schedule. Now over on the left, what we see here is going to be all of our static loads. I have the tree option set to only show the static loads for this customer, so we don't see all of that large list we saw earlier, just the ones that we're interested in. So if I click OK, then it looks very similar to what we were looking at earlier in the static loads. These two trips or these two loads are the ones that I'm interested in. You'll recognize them from the stops here. And so the rotation I'm creating on the right is called Madison. So I'm interested in the stages that either leave from Madison, stage 1 of this trip, or return to Madison, stage 2 of this load or trip. And so I'm going to move those over to this rotation schedule window, meaning I'm going to assign these stages to this rotation. And I'm going to start with where the driver leaves from, begins his day in Madison at 15:45. I'll left click on grab stage 1, hold down my mouse button, and drop it in on the right here. And that'll move it over. It shows me the customer and then the load number when I first pull it over. That's load 205844. And then I'm going to take stage 2 where the driver returns to Madison and also add that to this rotation, because this rotation is solely for the guys that leave out of Madison and return to Madison. So here's his leaving out point, and then I got to grab what stage 2, which takes him back to Madison. This also puts in the customer name and the load number 205845. Now, if I don't like the way this looks, the load number, I can put some other details in there. In the mail world, we have this load reference field that represents the trip number. So for those of you in the postal environment, this would be your trip 1 and your trip 2. Those of you in the freight environment, you may have a different series of numbers here to represent like the company's load number that they gave you when you accepted the load. But if you wanted to rename these so that you had a better, clear idea of what exactly these two stages represented, then you can do that at this point. The way you do that is you right-click on this segment name, is what we refer to it as, a segment of the rotation, and you would just type in what you want it to be. In this case, this first one, this 844, is trip 1, and so what happens a lot of times is people call this trip 1 and press the enter key, and it renames it, puts the load number in trip 1. This will revert to the customer number here in a second. Same thing was here, 123 dB, this stage 2. It's a very small 2 on your screen there. If I right click on that, I can call it trip 2 because it represents stage 2 of trip 2, our load reference number here. Hit the enter key, so that's trip 1 and trip 2. So the driver leaves out of Madison to Lake Mills on trip 1. You see that here. And then they return from Lake Mills back to Madison on trip 2. And so he goes trip 1, and then he does the backside of trip 2. That's my sequence section. Now, if there's anything else, if there were any other, you see when I open this up now, I see stage 1 is part of my Madison rotation. And on this trip, stage 2 is part of my Madison rotation. So I've now assigned them, similar to the way we see the driver's names underneath this in the load plane or the route plane. We now see the rotation name underneath. So that's the sequence section. We basically move over the stages of the static loads that are going to be a part of this rotation. And we like to put them chronologically if we can. In the way that the driver runs them. He leaves at 15:45 out of trip 1, and he returns, gets back into Madison at 19:25 in trip 2, So I put them in the order of trip 1 and then trip 2. So as we create the rotation, we started in setup. We're now in the sequence section. We've moved over the stages that pertain to the Madison rotation. And now we want to go into the next button down, or the driver schematic, or the driver schema. So we move top down here. If I left click on driver schematic, I see my window changes again. I no longer need to view my loads, so I've removed that far left window, and now I have the same buttons on the left, and on the right I have this little spreadsheet layout of the two trips or route segments that are a part of this rotation. If I hover over them, it'll tell me what they are, but I can also read it here. It's the customer, 123DB, in this case the mail contract, trip 1, stage 1, see the little green one here, and then stage 2 of trip 2. So I know what I need to assign here. Now what we also notice is there's a rotation group, still the same one that we're working with. That's our rotation name, Madison. And then we have a little box here to select the driver letter. And that's what we're going to do here in a moment. If we look below, we see kind of a spreadsheet layout that shows all the days of the week that this trip may or may not run. Since it's a 7-day cycle, we're going to display all 7 days of the week. The first column is going to be based on that rotation start date that we chose back in the setup section. So we just bounce back there for a moment and look at this Madison rotation and see our start date. Well, if we remember, our start date was set on the 19th of this week, which was a Sunday, and that's why that first column in our driver schema or our driver schematic is a Sunday, and that's what I refer to as you always want to try and keep that the same day of the week, because as you look at multiple rotations and you're working in your system, you're bouncing between rotations. It's always good to know that the first column in the driver schematic is that day of the week. We see the rotation start date is the 19th. If we pull down our calendar, we see the 19th is a Sunday, and that's why back here in the driver schematic for this rotation, the first column is a Sunday based on that start date. So this is where it comes into play. You just want that to be the same day of the week as you move between your rotations. So if I were to change rotations and look at one other than Madison, I would want that to also be Sunday as the first column. Now what we need to do here is we need to populate these cells with a 2-digit letter combination for the driver that takes these stages on the appropriate days. If we remember from our static load, this trip does not run on Saturdays, day 7, Sunday, day 1, or Monday, day 2. It only runs Tuesday through Friday. So I'm only going to populate these 4 columns with driver initials only on the day that the load runs. And so this trip runs, and let's grab a driver letter out of Madison. I think we're going to use Scott Little, I think, is the driver's name. So if I click in my select driver letter field, I can back that up and type in SL, or I can scroll down my list, and I'm going to use SL. Now some folks consistently use the driver initials to represent that driver that takes it on that day. From a LoadTrek point of view, we don't care if you use the driver initials. We don't care if you use any other mechanism that you want to. It's just a placeholder, if you will. So it's a 2-digit, 2-character combination that holds the place for the driver that's going to take that load on that day. Initials are common. The problem you run into is you'll have 2 drivers named John Brown or Jim Brown or Joe Brown. So JB works for one driver, but there may be other JBs in your system that you'll have to come up with a different 2-digit code for to hold that placeholder. So initials are good in the beginning, but as you get bigger or more drivers come on board, then sometimes it's better to use maybe a different set of a different way to trigger that driver. And we'll talk about why we do that here in a moment. So let's say we're going to use driver SL. We also need to assign a color to these initials or this 2-digit code. If I hit change color, I can choose a color from my color palette. Let's just use a dark green here for Mr. Little. Click OK. You'll see it'll fill in that color with the green. And then the way we populate these fields here is we simply just left click wherever we want that driver's code to appear. And so Mr. Little takes trip 1 on Tuesday. And so he takes that out of Madison and goes to the Lake Mills relay. If we remember, that's what trip 1, stage 1 is. And he also does it on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So he does this as his normal routine Tuesday through Friday. What he also does is he meets that driver in Lake Mills and comes back to Madison with trip 2. And so I fill in his code for these cells as well. Now we know the trip doesn't run on Sunday, Monday, and Saturday. So I can just leave these cells blank, which is about what 50% of our customers do. The other 50% of our customers will choose a 2-digit combination here of XX or ZZ or something similar, and they'll often make it a red color to indicate that it doesn't run. So let's just do that as an example. And they fill that in here. And you don't have to do this, but sometimes it's nice to not have empty cells, and you have this visibility to know that these trips, trip 1 and 2 for this customer, don't run on these days, and that's what the XX represents for some of our customers. Some folks leave it blank, some folks put in XX. You can do either of the two. SL, as we know, is going to be a driver that takes these stages on the days of the week, Tuesday through Friday. So SL is all fine and dandy, but now we need to make the connection between the 2-digit code SL and the driver that actually is going to be assigned that trip. And where we do that is in the button here called Drivers. That's where we make the assignment between the driver themselves and the 2-digit code that we've assigned them. Let's go ahead and we're going to skip this button for a moment and go down the Drivers. What we see when we do that is the same information in the center of our screen, same buttons on the left, but on the right now we have the ability to view some of our drivers and see their names. And it's this visibility that helps us to know who's going to be taking trip 1 and 2 Tuesday through Friday. And we have SL in here, and I was going to assign this here to Mr. Little, Scott Little. So if I left click on Mr. Little's name and drag it over and link him to that 2-digit code SL and let go of my mouse button, it now replaces the SL with Mr. Little's driver ID number, 61925. So I know that Mr. Little is the one that's assigned to this rotation. Now if I bounce to a different rotation just for a moment, come back to my Madison rotation, what you see here on the right is Mr. Little's icon has changed, and this would refresh whenever you come back into your rotation screen. There's a little bit of different icons for different drivers here. A two-person icon, if we look at that one, we'll left click on Miss Buchan's name here. It tells us that she's also part of a rotation called Milwaukee, and she's a part of this rotation called MKE Lake Mills Origin. Miss Byer is part of the Milwaukee rotation. Mr. Gallagher is part of the Milwaukee rotation. So these drivers are part of another rotation. Down here is our little key. Driver is assigned to another rotation if we see like a 2-person icon. Yellow, a yellow shirted driver, is assigned to the current rotation. So if we look at Mr. Little, he's assigned to the Madison rotation, sure enough, because that's what we just did. We've linked him to his 2-digit code of SL, and he's now part of the Madison rotation. A driver that's in green is simply available to be used for this rotation or for any others. So Mr. Bollinger isn't assigned to any rotation. He's available, meaning he's wearing a green shirt here. And so this gives us an idea of what drivers we can assign. Now we could assign Mr. Gallagher, even though he's part of a different rotation, maybe on the Milwaukee rotation is when he works on Mondays. So he could still do these loads for us the other days of the week, but we'd have to look at the Milwaukee rotation. Just gives us a visual cue to let us know, hey, before you assign this driver, you might want to be aware that you're double booking him, so to speak. He may be taking other things as part of a different driver rotation. So that's what we see here. Now the XX, do we need to assign a driver to the XX placeholder? We don't, because the trip doesn't run on that day, so we can just leave that as XX as our visual cue to let us know that the trip doesn't run that day. No one needs to take it on those days. That's our driver section. Now there's 2 other buttons here that are similar to the driver schematic. One is called the equipment schematic, and let's take a look at that one. It's laid out exactly the same as the drivers. It actually even uses the term driver letter here, but allows us to assign a piece of equipment on the days that this trip runs as well. So we know Mr. Little takes these loads Tuesday through Friday. If we want to assign him a specific truck to take on those days, we could do that here. We can grab a letter combination. Once again, it's just a placeholder. In this case, it's going to represent the truck, so there's no real initial tie-in or anything else that we can use. We'll just grab a color here for this, and we'll say that we want them to use the truck that's represented by the 2-digit code AD. Likewise, we could fill in an XX on these days because it doesn't run on those days, the same way we did it for the drivers. There's really no deviation here from how the driver assignment occurs. Now if we go down to equipment, rather than look at the list of drivers on the right-hand side, I see all my trucks here, pieces of equipment that I can assign. And so the same icons apply, whereas this may be already a part of a different rotation. This piece of equipment's available, etc. So let's say he's going to take truck 183. I drag it over and link it there. Now I see the truck number 183 come in. Pretty simple. Works just the same as the driver schematic and the drivers, except it just renders equipment. I would say maybe 30 to 40% of our customers currently have a dedicated piece of equipment built into a driver rotation. So when it assigns that driver, hey, you're running trips 1 and 2 on Tuesday, you're also assigned a truck 183. Because of the nature of equipment, and maybe it's not always available for that driver depending on where else it was, a fair amount of our customers don't do equipment assigning in the database, but you can, and that's exactly what these two fields are designed for. So if we do a quick review of this rotation, we did the setup, we named it, we scheduled how often it runs. Madison, it's a 7-day rotation. It begins on a Sunday. It began on this past 19th is what we wanted it to start on. Now today's the 22nd already, so we have some issues where we may need to repost in the database or copy stuff, but that has to do with what's already been posted. We'll talk about that later. But gives us an idea of this rotation. So the first thing we did was we created it, we named it, scheduled the start date, created the cycle, rotates every week, and then we put in the origin and destination for the driver. Now if we take a look in our sequence, we see the 2 stages that we added to this rotation, and if I left click on them here on the right hand side, it opens the load on the left. So we see we're doing stage 1 is part of the Madison rotation, Madison to Lake Mills. Stage 2 hasn't been assigned, so we need to assign this to a different rotation, a rotation where the drivers leave out of Milwaukee and return to Milwaukee. Same thing with stage 1 of trip 2. It's currently unassigned. We don't have it assigned to a rotation. So let's go ahead and grab our Milwaukee rotation. We actually have one in there for Milwaukee, and let's take a look at that one. If we look at that one here in the sequence section, we see that there's already some stages of other trips that are assigned to this rotation. Let's look at those by clicking on the driver schematic. We see that there's already some other customers and some other contract trips that different drivers are assigned to. Driver BB, driver JW, driver SB. Here's some of the X's to let us know on the days that it doesn't run. And so this is already part of it. Maybe we have a bunch of Milwaukee drivers, and there's different customers and different trips and loads that they take out of Milwaukee. So we can add to this. We don't have to necessarily create a brand new Milwaukee rotation. We can add to this rotation with those 2 stages that we're interested in. And so let's find those. It's going to be stage 1 of trip 2 that leaves out of Milwaukee. So let's left click and drag that over and add it to our existing Milwaukee rotation. And then stage 2 that returns to Milwaukee on trip 1, grab that and add that in there. And so we can rename these if we want. Once again, you right click on it. We can put in the trip number if that's important for us. And so he leaves out of trip 2 out of Milwaukee at 15:15 to 16:50. And then he grabs the relay at 16:55, goes back to Milwaukee at 19:10. So he does trip 2 and then trip 1. If we look at our driver's schematic, we'll see that these 2 lines have been added to our grid, and we need to populate them on the days that they run with the appropriate driver 2-digit code and placeholder and so on. So we just want to kind of continue doing what we did earlier. We didn't have to create this Milwaukee rotation. It was already in our system for drivers that leave and return to Milwaukee, but now we've added a couple segments to it. So now we need to fill those in. In this case, we're going to use driver PD, and we'll pick a color for Mr. PD. Maybe he's dark blue. Well, we have dark blue already, but that's okay. And we know these trips run Tuesday through Friday because we just did that with our Madison rotation. Doesn't run on Sunday, Monday, or Saturday. If we wanted to put in the XX, we could. And we can make it red if it's a little more obvious. Fill that in appropriately. Whoops. You'll notice that if you make a mistake, if I didn't want this to be XX, I just go ahead and click in that field again and it clears it out. If I click in there a third time, it puts it back in. And then we'll go over, that was our driver schematic. Now we'll go over to our drivers and make the link between the placeholder PD and the actual driver himself. I may not have given it too much time to think here, but let's go ahead and push it through. And so here's our placeholder PD, and we're going to grab Mr. Downey here and left click on him and drop him on that, and it changes to his driver number 22630. The icon doesn't update immediately, but it will next time we look at this. It does tell us that these other drivers in yellow are already part of this rotation. You see 21875, this driver is already part of that rotation. Equipment schematic, we'll see if we have any equipment in there. We're not using the equipment. Maybe in Milwaukee the drivers trade equipment. We're not sure exactly who's going to be taking it. It's based on availability of the truck, so we don't necessarily have to put in any equipment schematic here. And then we're finished. Let's go back to the setup of this Milwaukee rotation, make sure it is the way we want it to be, in the sense that we've added to it. We've added a couple segments on there, but we want to be clear to make sure that the origin and destination match what we're expecting for these 2 drivers. Let's go ahead and click on it. It always highlights the top rotation whenever you come back into the setup section, 3SB 187. Let's go down here to Milwaukee, and we'll see that the drivers that are part of this rotation start in the yard and leave in the yard, and that's kind of how we want it, so we're okay there. That's all you need to do to create the rotation. Now tonight, as the loads post, we're going to fast forward the clock here and say the loads have posted for tomorrow. What will that look like in our route plane for tomorrow? So let's take a look at that. I've gone ahead and run that ahead of time, kind of like a cooking show, I guess, where they always have what they're making already cooked and prepared for, and they pull it right out. But let's take a look at the route plane for tomorrow. Right now we're looking at the 16th. That's what we were looking at earlier, but I'll go into my tree options. I'll change this to the 23rd. What you see down here is on the 23rd, we have those 2 trips posted for tomorrow. If we look at those, we see the drivers and how they're assigned. And so let's go ahead and refresh our tree here, actually. Click over here. It would be good if I did the date correctly. So let's go back here and choose February 23rd. I accidentally backed it up to January 23rd. And so what we see here is that driver Peter Downey has a route assigned to him, and driver Scott Little does, and that matches what we see over here on the right when we look at the loads themselves. And we see that Mr. Downey is our Milwaukee driver, and he's scheduled to leave out of the yard, go to the Milwaukee post office, to the relay back to Milwaukee, and finish in the yard. And Mr. Little likewise is our Madison driver, and he leaves out of the LoadTrek office to the Madison post office to the relay where he meets up with Mr. Downey and swaps out, comes back to Madison, and so on. So this is what we want to see in the route plane as the load posts. So when the load posts every evening, however many days in advance our database is set to, these assignments will also happen as part of that posting process. So there was no dispatch that needed to be done in order for these loads to show up on the day that they run and for them to auto-assign to the drivers in the correct order and the correct layout. So ideally, the rotations are set up to automate that entire process, and the driver just needs to be aware of what he needs to run that day, either sign on to the website or just know that that's his schedule if he's been doing it for a period of time. And he comes in the morning, signs on his keypad, and this is the route that he'll get available to him to load and execute. So there's no manual assignment, manual dispatching, anything that needs to be done for these drivers. On the 24th, it'll be the same way. The load will post for the 24th. Mr. Downey will get stage 1 of this load and stage 2 of this load. Mr. Little will get stage 1 of trip 2 and then stage 2 of trip 1 to bring him back home to Madison. That's the idea behind the rotations. On the rotation, the drive rotation is the most complex thing we do in LoadTrek in the sense of setting one of those up. You have to have a good knowledge of the static loads, how they run, what days they post. You have to have a good knowledge of which driver takes which stage, how their route will be built, where they originate and destinate from. And you have to have a good understanding of the timing and make sure things flow and are assigned correctly in the order that the driver runs them. It's not difficult. It just requires an understanding of how the system works, and that's why I consider it to be one of the most complex things that we do. When you get into the advanced driver rotations, what we mean by that is the driver leaves out, and you did an easy example here today, but if the driver left out at about 2300 and returned home the next day with a load that didn't start until that next morning, then there are some ways you can manipulate the rotation so that it can still auto-assign correctly to the driver, but does involve him coming home or coming back with a trip that didn't start until the next morning. And it's those type of rotations that sometimes need a little bit of a manipulation to the rotation. I don't want to get into it today. Number one, there's a time issue, and number two, it's good to have a fundamental understanding of the layout of a simple rotation like the one we created here before we move on to what I would consider to be an advanced rotation, where it involves the driver coming home on a trip the next day and so on. When we build the driver rotation, we're always interested in what the driver does, not necessarily how the load runs, because this load that we're going to build a customer for is going to be from Milwaukee to Madison, 2 different drivers. So at any point, one driver is never executing this load in the order that it runs and that it's billed, but 2 different drivers will take half of it each, and then we'll bill our customer as if it ran consecutively. And so when we talk about driver rotations, we're not too concerned about how the trip runs, and we're more concerned with what the driver does, where they leave from, where they return to, and in what order they execute those stages. I'm going to pause now because I ran quite a bit longer, which always happens when we talk about rotations, but we do have time available. I have plenty of time available here, at least another 15 minutes if necessary, to answer any questions that you have on driver rotations. And I would like to know, for folks that are familiar with these kind of simple rotations, if the value of adding in another advanced rotation lesson. So we can type in the question area if you have a question, and if you wanted to know a little bit more from an advanced rotation point of view, please go ahead and just type in there and say, I would love to know more about more complex rotations, and I'll schedule another session here. I will get to that original question in a moment, but I want to make sure if there's any other questions first, because that original question touches on some advanced functionality. I'll read this next one here. Good question. Using a 7-day rotation as an example, when making a change or addition to an existing rotation, kind of like we did with that Milwaukee rotation, is it necessary to bring the rotation start date forward to the appropriate day for the current week? The answer to that is no. We don't have to make a change to that start date. And let's take a quick look back at that Milwaukee rotation. If you remember, that rotation existed in our database, and we just added a few lines or segments to that rotation. If we look at the original Milwaukee rotation, it was originally had a start date of 11/20/2005, quite a while ago. And so what we were interested in is we wanted to make sure that it's a Sunday, because that helps us keep it in line with our other rotations. And so if it isn't a Sunday, we probably don't want to manipulate it because it may affect some of those postings. So you really don't want to change this date provided it matches, the rest of your rotations. So as you're building those rotations, you may want to get ahead of it and say, hey, whoever's building rotations, always have them start on a Sunday. Even if the trip doesn't start on Sunday, in our case it didn't, it doesn't run Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, we still set the rotation on a Sunday because all of our other existing rotations started on that day. We want to have that uniformity. And so because it was already a Sunday, there was no need for us to change it, even though we added a couple lines to it. We've basically said these two that we just added today are only going to start running from today on forward. We didn't even have these trips in our system back in 2005. That doesn't matter, and it won't go back and post those systems back into 2005. It's only going to post forward. And so as the days go forward here, we're going to add these trips to this driver rotation, and now Mr. Downey will be assigned this route composed of trip 2 and trip 1, a round trip route, on Tuesday through Friday of every week going forward until we make a change. If we were to edit this, we talk about editing a driver. I'm going to touch on that in a moment. I do want to answer the other question first to make sure that the gentleman doesn't think I forgot about him. So, the other question dealt with wraparounds in a sense, and that's more an advanced feature, and we will hold an advanced rotations session based on some of the feedback I'm getting here. But basically there are scenarios where a driver would leave out on a Saturday. Let's say Mr. JP here leaves out on Saturday with this trip or this load for this customer, and he comes back on the Sunday, and the rotation starts on a Sunday and only runs through Saturday. Currently in the system, we can't connect what he does on Saturday to what he does on Sunday as a round-trip route for him that begins on Saturday night. We can't make that connection around the boundary of the rotation. In a sense, post this on Saturday and also post what starts on the next week on Saturday night as well, which is how the route would have to be. He has to run it on Saturday night even though it doesn't run until Sunday. Within the rotation we can do that, but wrapping around the rotation is currently a limitation. What that means is we often have to leave loads that start on Sunday morning uncovered and manually move those to the driver's route on Saturday night in the route plane. So that's still currently an issue. The question is really, hey, when are you going to get around to fixing that? And the answer is it's a difficult proposition. It's not as easy as it looks, and that's kind of a silly answer. It doesn't really give you any details, but the LoadTrek in general is migrating to more of a web-based interface, and there's some major changes that will be coming down the road. Nothing major from a user interface point of view, but from a behind-the-scenes thing. Those changes will allow us to make that rotation wraparound. So we'd like to complete that before the summer of this year is really what we're shooting as a deadline. It may be sooner than that, hopefully not later than that, but sometime this year we hope to rectify that rotation wraparound answer. Not the best answer in the world, but hopefully something that a target date we can hit and resolve that. I'll take a few more questions coming through here. Advanced rotation info would be great, so we will schedule that. Why are the placement initials necessary? Is it just for planning purposes? Can you go ahead and assign drivers to the rotation, and how are those initials generated? It's a good question as well. The placement of that 2-digit code, like we see here in the driver schematic, the reason why we have that placement there is it allows you to swap drivers without necessarily having to change this 2-digit placement area. The reason that we do that is kind of it's a placeholder. So the driver that takes these trips, let's use Mr. BB here, Monday through Friday, and then Monday through Friday, and also an additional trip Tuesday through Saturday. So this is kind of everything that BB does probably in a weekly time basis. If we wanted to change this to a different driver without having to go and change the initials, we could simply go into drivers, and instead of using 21875, grab a different driver and assign it to that placeholder. So the placeholder acts as a way to reserve those stages to a driver, and then we can swap the drivers here in the driver section. But you do need the placeholder first to coordinate which driver is going to be taking which stages. And it comes in handy as these rotations can get pretty big. The Milwaukee rotation, any drivers that leave out of Milwaukee and return to Milwaukee could be part of this rotation. So this rotation could end up being, the full screen here. And then having the placeholder gives us an idea of the workload assigned to a particular driver using those using that placeholder. And allows for swapping drivers in the event that someone's terminated and you rehire them to take all the stages that previously guy did. You don't have to go in and change everything. You can simply link that driver to that placeholder. The way you would do that, and someone's pointed that out as far as the questioning and the question answer, is it's a two-step process. You would take this no assignment and you'd remove Mr. BB, or actually you're removing driver 21875 from the BB placeholder. And so if we bounce between rotations for a second, we'll come back to that Milwaukee rotation. We see now that placeholder has been reset, or now it's available for another driver to be assigned to that placeholder. We don't necessarily have to change BB to whoever it is, but we could just grab Mr. Little. We know Mr. Nichols is available. He has a green shirt here. We can say now he's going to be he's going to take over for whoever was taking those stages, because we fired that guy and now Mr. Nichols is filling his spot. So we drag over the no assignment and then we drag over the new driver. So that's kind of how we can replace a driver in a rotation. Now, when do we need to replace a driver in a rotation? You want to do that when someone's kind of terminated and someone's hired in their spot. But what you don't want to do, in the sense from the route plane goes, let's take a look back at our routes for the 23rd. We know that Mr. Little and Mr. Downey are taking what they take every Tuesday through Friday, the Madison and Milwaukee trips. And so when we get into the route plane, if for some reason on the 23rd, because that's tomorrow, we get a call tonight from Mr. Downey and he says, hey, I'm not going to make it tomorrow. Something happened. It's just not going to work. So Mr. Little's still taking his portion out of Madison and meeting whoever Mr. Downey's replacement is. But I don't want to go into my rotation and change anything there, because as soon as Mr. Downey feels better, he's going to be taking this load again on Thursday and Friday, and then next Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday again. So I don't want to mess with my rotation. I just want to do the load move, or the route move, that we've done before in the route plane. Grab the route sign underneath Mr. Downey. We call Jerry and say, Jerry, you got to take what Pete was going to do on the 23rd, and we just move it to Mr. Bollinger. So now Mr. Bollinger is going to be the driver that meets up with Mr. Little. However, Mr. Downey will still be assigned tomorrow's run, or I'm sorry, the 24th run, because hopefully he's feeling better. So we still want our rotation to continue to post according to who's supposed to take it, and just make a one-time move if a driver's not available. All right. Kind of go through here. There ever be a reason to bring the rotation start date forward unless you wanted to change the day of the week on which the rotation started? That would probably be the only reason to change that rotation start date, to kind of follow up to your original question. Keep in mind that if you change the origin start date, you may need to manipulate your driver schematic, because the first column that may have been a Monday, if you change the date to make it a Sunday, those drivers are still going to be assigned to that first column, and they may not take it on Sunday, and you need to move everything over a column. And so it's a little bit dangerous to play with that rotation start date after the fact, because those drivers that are in column 1, when column 1 was Monday, if we change it, the start date, so now column 1 is Sunday, those drivers' initials or the placeholder will need to be moved over one column. So that's something to keep in mind when we talk about manipulating the rotation start date. And so I've heard from a handful of folks that the advanced rotations are a good feature. Chances are I may have already spoken with you about advanced rotations, but it's always good to refresh. There are things that remind me that I'm making mistakes or could make a mistake every time I try and set up a new rotation. So we'll schedule an advanced rotation lesson maybe as early as next week, and we'll record it and make it available just like we are the rest of these. And then a reminder here to make sure the driver terminated has had his assignment unassigned before the driver's terminated in LT. That's a good answer too. Or, I'm sorry, it's a good comment. Thank you. When you go to terminate a driver, let's say Mr. Little here. We have Mr. Little here. He's assigned this trip for tomorrow, the 23rd. If I were to go into the driver section and look to terminate Mr. Little, we now have a pop-up that just reminds you that you may want to remove that assignment from that driver before you terminate him. So let's see if we can find Mr. Little here. The reason that is that once a driver goes into a terminated status, and I'll pause for a moment, once a driver goes into a terminated status, they may not be visible here in the route plane. So if I didn't move that route from him, from Mr. Little onto someone else before I terminate him, I may not have the ability to see that route to move it in the future. So you do want to do that ahead of time. And we did, I believe, and I want to make sure this is working properly. If we go to Scott Little here, he's currently status of active. In order to terminate him, you see the termination field is gray. I need to change his status to terminated. If I do that, I should, this says this will remove the driver from any rotations that are assigned. So I may want to hit no here and say no, I still want him to be part of that rotation. So it'll remove him from the rotation. However, as the user pointed out here, before we do that, we want to make sure that we remove any routes from Mr. Little, so that if he goes away here, we don't have the visibility to do that. There's also a nice report that we have here, and hopefully I can find it fairly easy. It's probably under driver routes and rotations. If we run that, it'll ask us what driver. So if you're interested in terminating a driver, sometimes it's, and this may be new, some folks may not have seen this yet, pull up that driver first before you're going to terminate and run this report, and it will tell you, the data view will let you know that Mr. Little is currently part of an active rotation called Madison, and the rotation's active. And he's also been assigned a route 124722, and it's been checked, meaning that it's been reviewed. And so if he had been assigned to a bunch of routes later in the week, they would all show here with the route number. So this is another way to, a little report to run before you terminate a driver. See route number 124722. It lets us know that he's assigned a route in the system to let us know that maybe you need to remove that route and clear him out of that rotation before you go ahead and terminate him. When you terminate him, it will remove him from the rotation, but it'll keep that placeholder of SL and so on. So you may want to go ahead and run this report, make the necessary steps before you terminate the driver. Thank you for pointing that out. It's something that comes in handy here when we talk about terminating drivers that are part of rotations. So let me view the attendee list here for a second. And so the advanced rotations deal with drivers leaving on one day, picking up on a load the next. Also deals with maybe some of that wraparound stuff. So I'll work on trying to schedule an advanced driver rotation webinar for next week. We have our normal Monday and Wednesday webinars, as we discussed. I think it's IFTA and fuel tax, and then reports and data views. So in addition to those, we'll schedule an advanced driver rotation. I'll probably open that up to all customers, and then you will receive it'll be a different invitation entirely, so it won't be part of next week's normal LT 101 session, but I'll try and schedule that for next week, perhaps Tuesday, or perhaps some other day other than Monday and Wednesday. And then if I can, based on a calendar, we'll schedule that, and then I'd invite you to join. We can continue some of the advanced rotation questions. Let me just review and make sure I haven't forgotten anyone, but that's about it. Well, thank you all. Rotations can be, as I mentioned, a complex thing. If you understand rotations, more importantly, if you understand advanced rotations that we'll cover next week, there's really nothing in LoadTrek that you can't get your head around, because it's probably the most complex thing that we do. And we'll discuss that again next week. I hope you can join. I hope you can invite others at your company if they are interested in rotations, or if they're the ones that have to manage them. It can be very helpful. Likewise, we can answer a few basic questions if we need to, but we'll assume a certain amount of knowledge, and we'll go right into some of the complex routes that can be created from rotations. Thank you again. Enjoy the rest of your day. Appreciate you staying with me an extra 17 minutes here, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Monday at our next webinar and later in the week as well. Have a great day.